From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Flourish DX, Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, and I'm your host, Kim MacDonald. And today I'm very excited that Alison Butler is here with us today as my guest. And welcome, Alison.
Thank you so much, Kim. It's so exciting to be here.
Thanks. A little bit about Alison. Alison is a certified mental health first aid trainer for workplaces. She's also an entrepreneur, and she is a very amazing advocate for changing the way people think about mental health and about reducing stigma and also self-care, the importance of self-care. So, Alison, what I do with each of these podcasts is ask the person to give our listeners a little bit of a background on the journey you had to do the work that you do.
Oh, I would love to. So my journey, like so many people's journeys, I guess, is not very straightforward. I never imagined early in my career that I would be doing this work. So I started early on in my career working for a local nonprofit, and I was on the education side of things. So I was spending a lot of time in workplaces, sort of from a health and safety perspective in the area of prevention, educating employers and employees. And so I was doing that for about 15 years. And throughout, yeah, I know it was a while.
That's a good stretch. Yeah.
And so throughout that time, I completed my master's degree in employment relations and really took a stronger interest, I guess, in employee well-being, what that looks like, how are we supporting one another at work, kind of from that human resources lens, I guess. And then something interesting happened. So about 7 years ago now, I started to not feel well. That's usually the best way I describe it to other people. I just didn't feel good. And I couldn't really pinpoint what it was that was happening with me. And I was proactive. I started going for medical appointments, different types of appointments, saying, hey, like there's something going on here. Please tell me what it is. And I wasn't really getting any straightforward answers, but I was having kind of signs and symptoms. So that went on for a little while, and much to my surprise, I eventually received a diagnosis of depression and anxiety. And I can honestly say now it was the best thing that ever happened to me. But at the time, I couldn't help but thinking, why couldn't I see this? I didn't see this coming. I didn't recognize it as being a mental health thing, just because the way that it sort of presented itself wasn't what I guess I thought mental health looked like. Now that I have the education, it's really obvious. But, I just sort of started thinking to myself, well, I didn't see this. I didn't see this happening. I didn't understand it. So, as a well-educated professional, if I didn't see it or understand it, how many other people are out there that don't see it or understand it? And that really kind of started my journey. I was already up in front of people teaching and training. And I thought, how do I bring more awareness to this? And I started speaking really openly about my own experiences, which I think it's why a lot of people find me really relatable. I'm just very open. And then I went and discovered really mental health first aid training, became a facilitator for that program so that I could start bringing more awareness and education into workplaces. And I have been doing that for the past 4 years. And it's been a really amazing journey.
Wow. So I know that you do training all across Canada, and you do it virtually, and you also do it in person. Is that correct, or mostly? Yeah, for both ways.
That is correct. I actually teach, there's many different versions of mental health first aid. I actually, right now, as of this recording time, teach 3 different versions of mental health first aid. So
describe them a little bit.
Yeah. So one of the versions is just called Basic. So that is a program that's delivered over 2 days in person. And I also teach more condensed versions of the training. So that is standard virtual. Participants complete a online module on their own independently, and then come into training with me live virtually over a period of time. And then there's a similar version called face-to-face, which is a fairly new version of mental health first aid. So in a similar fashion, participants complete an online module first, and then come into a more condensed version of the training with me live face-to-face. But virtual has been very popular over the last couple of years. I taught exclusively virtually for almost 2 years during kind of our peak COVID times. Sure. And, some people really enjoy being face-to-face. I think there is a lot of value as well in the virtual training, and it's certainly allowed a lot of people to receive the training, and I can deliver to people no matter where they are, right? It really opened up that accessibility. I was having course participants who maybe live in more rural areas that, weren't able to drive into a larger center to sit in a public training course.
Right.
Yeah. So it's been a really beautiful thing. And I genuinely love all the versions of the training. It kind of comes down just to personal preference, or when I'm working with workplaces, their preferences for how they want to train people. But yeah, it's fabulous.
Tell me a little bit about, I have taken mental health first aid, but it's been a while. So Alison, I know I need a refresher. So I think you and I had talked about it. I was like trying to get my young adult, children, they're young adults now, encouraged to take this program because I do believe in it, and I believe it's very fundamental. So share a little bit on the content in the program.
Sure. And I usually try to really simplify how I describe the content. So at its core, here's how I describe mental health first aid. We learn in the training program how to identify the signs that someone may be struggling with their mental health. I would go so far as to say those signs can also help us identify that someone might be struggling in other areas of their life, because those signs can really be across the board signs of many different things. But how to tell if someone is struggling with their mental health or is in crisis? What do I need to know? What do I need to watch for? What can I be paying attention to even know, is this something, that could be of concern? The second big piece, and the thing that I think is the reason why a lot of people come to take the training, is we learn how to have a conversation with someone about their mental health and well-being.
Okay.
And I think this is the thing that scares most people, right? There can still be a lot of stigma around mental health. There can be a lot of fear. What if I bring up this topic with someone and they get upset with me, right? What if I say the wrong thing? I want to be supportive, but I don't know what to say. I'm not sure. So I'm just going to say nothing at all, right? Tends to be a very common thread. And so a really key part in mental health first aid is that we are learning right down to some very specific pieces of language. What do we say? How do we start this conversation? How do we act as an effective listener, which I think all of us can do better at no matter what our role is. And then how do we encourage supports for someone that might be struggling? So that's a real key part of mental health first aid. also, how do we support someone who is in crisis or maybe in crisis are some really key skills there. And
which can really be, certainly in the workplace too, can be very, challenging for someone to be able to, recognize when this is a crisis, or this is like distinguishing between crisis and distinguishing between, that this is an opportunity for conversation.
Absolutely.
So those kinds of things in the workplace, trying to discern some of those, I think would be part of that challenge, and the awkwardness and uncomfortableness with trying to figure that out, so that you're also saying the right thing and doing the right thing at the right moment.
Absolutely. And I was just going to add that the newer versions of mental health first aid also have a significant focus on self-care for the first aider. So how are we actually supporting ourselves and our own mental health and well-being, which I am all about. So those are kind of the key things that we learn in mental health first aid. And I think it's such a foundational skill for all of us.
So when a workplace comes to you, what's the conversation that they have, or what is their purpose, or, what kind of ignites or has sparked their action to want their organization to, start thinking about mental health first aid and employees taking it?
Great question. I do think it sometimes varies. Sometimes workplaces have had an incident or a situation where they feel like, oh, this happened and we didn't really know how to handle it. So let's make sure that we do for future. Sometimes people are just recognizing, especially if they have, teams of managers or leaders, they're recognizing, okay, there's a lot of people here that are, either struggling with mental health, that are having challenges, that are potentially like taking sick leave or are absent. And it might be connected in with a mental health thing. So, let's make sure we have a good, solid foundation for our leadership team in understanding this. And then I think the ones that make me happiest are sort of the workplaces. I mean, no, I shouldn't say that. They all make me happy, but I really love.
People are the best.
That's right. I really love when workplaces are just very proactive, that they recognize that we need to be treating mental health as equally as important as physical health. And they're just saying, okay, we recognize this, we have either physical first aid or CPR training for our people. We also need to have mental health first aid training. And they're just taking that leap of identifying this as a core, foundational professional development or like skill that's needed for their workplace. So those are kind of the common things that I tend to see.
When you mentioned CPR and standard first aid, or those courses that we've taken in our careers, it's sort of, this is the third leg on the stool. So it's got CPR and we know that the recertification, and you need to take that. And many organizations have many people inside their organizations that have taken CPR and standard or basic first aid, which is the physical side of things, and for injuries that happen. So who are the people inside the organization that the organization sends to the program?
Before I answer that, I just wanted to make one comment about what you just said. I think it's so interesting. We take physical first aid and CPR with the idea that hopefully we can save a life, right? But mental health first aid works the same way, right? We need to be aware of the signs, the symptoms, particularly in crisis, with the same hopeful goal that we can prevent further challenges or save a life, right? It has the exact same, to me, kind of foundation there. I love your idea of the three legs on a stool.
I love the number 3, love it. And also triangles. I'm sure that a scientist will refute this, but I think it's one of the strongest, isn't it one of the strongest shapes in in geometry, physics. Yeah. Just when you need a physics person that's like, or yeah.
It's not me, Kim. It's not me.
It's like, darn. It's like, yes, but it is one of the strongest shapes. So there you go. 3-legged stool. Always the fabulous go-to analogy.
Wonderful. And I'll answer your other question now about who takes the training. So generally, organizations, they'll come to me. Sometimes they'll say, okay, we're just going to book in our leaders and managers to start with. I always, think that tends to be a good starting point. If you are someone who is leading or supporting other people, inevitably you're going to be encountering mental health challenges.
So anyone with who has supervisor responsibility.
Role. Yep. Sometimes organizations will put all of their employees through training. I love that, of course, because I think the more individuals that have the training, the more powerful it is in the workplace. Because, what happens if someone doesn't want to open up to their supervisor or their manager just because of that hierarchical structure? I think they need to have those skills, but I also think if we can get that peer-to-peer support, that can be really powerful as well. And sometimes if employers or workplaces come to me and we're having that conversation about, well, who should we train? My personal recommendation is always train your leaders, managers, supervisors, but also train those people within your workplace that are the ones that people go to anyway for stuff. I always call it stuff. I'm doing air quotes, which they can't see.
The trusted, it's sort of, within every workplace, I think there are people who, are the go-to for all sorts of different reasons and you go to them for help, tech support. It's sort of tech support help. You go to them when things are happening, you have to process something and talk something through. I do think they live throughout an organization.
They do. And I never know who those people are, but I will always say to employers and workplaces, you know who these people are, or you should. And that will often also be my recommendation. Doesn't matter what their role or their position is. Who are those people that are already the good listeners? The ones that are very supportive of their team members, the ones that people talk to, because they are more likely to be approached with difficult things. And so that's always just kind of my add-in tip about who should take this training.
I love that. That's great. The other folks I'm thinking of just now, which is the people who have the opportunity, more touch points with more people inside the organization, because some of the things that you've shared with me before too is, observing the indicators is a piece of, the work of helping with that triage if it's needed. So that people inside that have more frequency contact with others are also can be helpful in that, I think, in that sort of that cohort of who might be some of the best the first layer of folks, I guess, who take the training.
And then I guess to your point there as well, it depends on the workplace. But if the workplace has a forward public-facing component where there are people who are interacting a lot with members of the public, that's also a good starting point, right? Because you just, from a customer service perspective, you just don't know what you might encounter as well. So if the workplace has that component, I would often, recommend that be an element for training as well.
Okay. Do people wonder or are curious about, do I need a medical background or do I need any prerequisites to take the training?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I don't have a medical background. So the very short answer is no. I train participants from every different type of industry and walk of life and background that you could imagine. It is very straightforward. very non-medical, particularly in the newer versions of mental health first aid. I feel like they've really stripped it down to kind of the real core, and a lot just focused on those conversations and really generic signs, like not getting into specific medical things. It's not necessary, right? We don't have to have the same kind of in-depth knowledge of mental health that a counselor or a psychologist would have. And one of the key pieces, actually, I was having this conversation with someone the other day. One of the really key pieces to understand is it's not our job to be a counselor as a mental health first aider. And a lot of that comes down to the language that we use, how we support. We don't make recommendations. We encourage seeking supports. And so just the way we go about being a mental health first aider, it's designed for peer-to-peer, human-to-human, supporting one another. So you can come from any different background. I mean, just the sectors I've trained, transportation, mining, construction, aerospace, community organizations, nonprofits, government, small business owners, right? Like just everyone can benefit from this training.
I know there's a piece of it which is around some of the crisis interventions. So maybe just share a little bit of maybe some of the topics that you cover that for listeners.
Sure. So they're as part of mental health first aid, there are some, I kind of call them in my own words, touch points. So we spend some time covering core knowledge and concepts around, so we mentioned crisis, trauma, and suicide. So they're touch points. We spend a little bit of time there. We go over some of the key skills, what we need to know, how do we keep someone safe in the short term? And then there is additional knowledge sharing, I guess. So for someone who is interested in more in-depth training, I would then refer them to a program that I know you're familiar with, Assist, for example, from Living Works, which is a 2-day suicide intervention training. So
it's an amazing, I know you and I talked about this, it's an amazing, piece of the puzzle, and also for workplaces, I think, and definitely for certain industries that, you can go through some of the data and you can see that certain industries have higher rates of deaths by suicide.
Absolutely.
And so Assist is quite, it's a fabulous, obviously it's the same thing in terms of mental health first aid, where that is sort of the triage version. So you don't have to be a clinician in this way for Assist. It's something similar.
Yeah.
That you're trying to, in the moment, try to be safe for now.
Yeah, and we get those I call them touch points. I don't know if the Mental Health Commission would use other language, but I find like that's relatable to people. It's like we're getting some of those key core skills. We're learning, we're practicing them and learning, what would we do in this situation? There's a lot of scenarios in mental health first aid. So we're kind of working through scenarios of how would we support this person. So we're getting those touch points in our 2 or 1 day training, which I think is quite fabulous. And then if individuals want that more in-depth knowledge, then there are other training programs out there that can provide that kind of a deeper look at specifics.
Great. So when an organization comes to you, are they thinking about this as a part of their mental health strategy? Or are they thinking it, I'm just wondering how they're positioning it within the organization. Because you and I had talked about this is incredibly important information and foundational information inside the organization. And so I'm just wondering, what are you seeing inside organizations in terms of their approach to mental health?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it really depends on the organization. Some of them are really coming at it from sort of the occupational health and safety side of things. Like, okay, we recognize mental health, psychological health and safety as being a big concern. So we're kind of seeing this from our occupational health and safety lens, which is fabulous. I have other organizations who kind of come at it from the human resources side. So, they're saying, okay, we need to train our leadership to kind of support this knowledge building and this awareness. Maybe a little bit more from like a management and a professional learning side of things. Okay. But at the end of the day, it all kind of has the same result. I don't know, sometimes I don't always know how comprehensive an organization's mental health strategy might be. Certainly, I believe that a lot of organizations are using mental health first aid as a beginning point in trying to add into their employee wellness programs, add value for employees. And they're really seeing or recognizing that mental health is really important. And I do know that some organizations, like if they do, for example, yearly kind of wellness surveys or employee survey type of things where they're gaining input and feedback from the organization as a whole. I know that some have reached out to me after that when they're recognizing that, oh, okay, a lot of people are saying we feel that mental health is really important. And so they're using a lot of times mental health first aid, again, as sort of a baseline or a big beginning strategy to really get everyone on the same page with mental health, right? So that we know that when we're talking about mental health, we have the same understanding of it. We know that we're all kind of understanding these signs in, if not the same, at least in a similar way. And we know that we all kind of have this foundational knowledge for approaching concerns around mental health. And so, it is in my opinion, it is a really great starting point.
How would so the folks who do come to you for the occupational health and safety side of things, because we had talked about before, and you mentioned psychological health and safety, which is on the occupational side of things, which this podcast is all about, helping to share that and the connection, the link, and the impact of taking action in an occupational health and safety sort of point of view. How would you see mental health first aid training connect into, those efforts? I guess you said a little bit that sometimes it's the impetus for the reason that mental health first aid training comes in. Do you see them? I'm just wondering your own thinking as you go inside organizations, and how have you heard, or what are they doing on the occupational health and safety side? Just a window into organizations and some of the things that they're doing that kind of connect with mental health first aid.
Yeah, it's interesting, Kim, because I feel like sometimes a lot of organizations, they recognize psychological safety is a thing. It's an important thing. It's certainly, I know in your world and my world, it's being talked about a lot. If you go to any safety conference right now, there's usually a full stream or, many, speaking opportunities around mental health, psychological health and safety. So it's certainly trendy. I genuinely believe, though, that there is still, in a lot of organizations, not every organization, obviously there's so many that are being really proactive, but I feel like there's still a lot of organizations that just don't quite know where to start with that, right? Mm-hmm. It's like,
yes, I agree.
We know this is important. This is a thing. Everybody's talking about it. But where do we kind of begin with this? And, there's so much of psychological safety that is below the surface, if you will.
Yes.
Right? There's so much of that, not what we have written in policy, right? Not necessarily, that's important. That's important. Like,
but it's looking at the risk factors and the hazards that are occurring within an organization.
But what's actually happening below the surface, right? And that's so much harder to measure. It's so much harder to sometimes identify, right? Because it's how are people behaving? And, you know, to me,
it truly is. Yes.
Yeah, to me, in my sort of interpretation is, you know, at its simplest, I always say, like, psychological safety, does it feel safe to be 100% truly authentically me at work, right? Or, you know, do I have to hide myself? Do I feel like I can't speak up? Do I feel like I'll be punished if you know, there's so many nuances to it. And you know, something interesting that I've heard from workplaces is like, okay, well, you know, we've made the policy changes, so like it looks good on paper, and you know, we've you know, we're working on this, but our organization lacks trust, or our organization lacks, you know, some of these things that are, it's not solved in a 1 hour lunch and learn about mental health, right? It's foundational cultural things that are happening in workplaces. And so again, I do really think that, you know, mental health first aid is not the full, even close to the full answer either, but we're starting somewhere.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Gives that entry point, so that shared language, as you mentioned, is possible. And the more we can reduce the discomfort with organizations and organizational employees, with understanding this is another part of our health. So it's another part of our health, and it's impacted by a lot of different things, and a lot of different things inside organizations and a lot of different things outside organizations. So gaining greater comfort. It would be great to have workplaces looking at mental health first aid as they do CPR and standard first aid. So every year when they're thinking about who's new and who hasn't had it yet, and who do we have to think about that, so that we have all the mechanisms and all the competencies inside organizations that are looking towards physical safety and all the aspects of it, whether it's on the occupational health and safety sort of position, or whether it's thinking about workplace training or human resources. So there's lots of things that we do to manage safety inside an organization. This is an extension of it. We had an evolution for safety. We've had 100 years of physical safety evolution, and we certainly didn't start where we are now. We're in a much, much better place. But I do know that organizations struggle with the culture of, they absolutely believe and are working really hard for a physical safety culture. But we also know that humans are humans, and sometimes the behavior, it's a continuous, sustainable, strategy to make sure that continues inside organizations. And it is a difficult piece to realize that mental health and psychological safety inside an organization is the same thing. In everything, there are early adopters. There are early adopters and the innovators and early adopters. And then there are, the majority of organizations that then start to understand and see that they can actually integrate it into their operations, so that it isn't something that's in addition. It's the way we do business here.
Yeah.
We talk about mental health first aid and mental health awareness, and we also focus on psychological health and safety and managing the risk factors. And it does take some courage, I think, for organizations that are going to talk about risk that is embedded in the way the work is done. Because that's a bigger change, I think, for many organizations getting to that place. But there's all of these are entry points, which I think are really, really important. Like, find the entry point and the comfort for the organization, and mental health awareness or mental health first aid training can do that.
Yes.
And start with that, start the conversation and start the level of understanding. What are some of the surprising questions that people have asked you when you've had the training? Or I'm sure people are amazing. People are the best. So yeah, it's like, no, people are the worst. No, people are the best. It's like, so what are some of the interesting sort of things that people have shared, or maybe even the things that were the most intriguing to them inside in terms of the content?
This is a great question. One of these things that I find, I don't ever feel like there's bad questions in training, because I feel like it's such an opportunity to really engage in how did you think about this before, and what are maybe your biases, and how can we maybe change you 2% in your way of thinking about this, right? It's all part of a process. A few things that I love in training. One is that, likely because I'm so open about talking about my mental health, many, many people will share their stories about mental health. So that's really beautiful. Sometimes privately to me, but also other times, sometimes people open up in training with groups of their coworkers, which I think takes a lot of courage and really shares and helps to reduce some of the stigma. I'm not thinking of any specific example that I thought was really kind of wow, but I do tend to find, just in my experience with teaching, one of the more challenging pieces that people tend to have a harder time wrapping their head around is maybe around anxiety, which is very present in all of our workplaces, no matter what. But just in terms of anxiety as a mental health disorder and some of the nuances around that, I tend to find that a lot of people will sort of have aha moments around that. It's one of those things that can be difficult to understand if it's not something that you experience for yourself. So I do tend to find that people have a lot of learning moments around anxiety. And, very often, I train every day. I said every different type of educational background and training. I tend to find for what I would call very logical thinkers that a mental health first aid can be a bit of a stretch because you have to sort of, in some regards, take the logic out of it and recognize that, okay, I don't necessarily understand what this person is going through. It doesn't necessarily make logical sense to me, but I have to be able to recognize that if this person is sharing something with me, it's very real for them, and I need to take that seriously. So I often find that there can be a lot of learning pieces around that, and just the invisibility of it, right? You never know. You don't always know when someone's struggling. So, I mean,
I think it's it's so much invisibility to all of these conditions. And, there are, indicators and signs that, and when we look at the mental health continuum, which is, from the Mental Health Commission. So, all of the signs that are on that from thriving to injury and illness and a diagnosed illness, there are lots of things within that. And I do know that that's part of the conversation and part of the content to help people understand that. But I think you've really hit on something, which is believing. It's sort of believing what maybe you aren't experiencing right now, and believing and seeing those signs that are part of, that you now know is after the training, and believing that what you are seeing is, what you've just learned about, and then helping to be able to support that so that someone can be safer now and find help, do what you need to do. But you are merely there to do that, not to try to diagnose beyond that. It's really to assist someone finding some professional help if that's, what's required.
Yeah, absolutely. That is our role as a mental health first aider, is to assist. And I just think that there's so much opportunity to just gain a deeper understanding. Another thing that I really like to do in my training classrooms is just talk about, there's these signs, but it can present so differently in different people, right? And when we talk about the workplace, if someone is, just for example, I'll throw out a few examples. If someone is withdrawing, or if someone is lashing out in anger, what's behind that, right? There's people can behave in a lot of different ways when they're even stressed. And I know we're going to talk about this after, but stress is such an underlying piece of this equation as well. This mental health equation. I
know you shared, I think it was on, you had shared that 35% of working Canadians suffer from burnout. Yeah. Which is, when chronic stress comes to a place where you're in injury or illness. And that was a huge number.
It's a huge number. And I will just,
huge number.
I'll throw in there, because I've been questioned on it a couple of times. I think people weren't actually believing that this could possibly be a real statistic. And so it's from a Canada Life survey, just so everyone knows. Yeah. It does actually come from a source. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's it's the same with 1 in 5 Canadians suffering from a mental health issue every year. That's huge. And, 35% also, that's a huge number. But we also know it's sort of a range and a spectrum of experiences for people. Yeah.
I have to say, Kim, doing this work all the time, those numbers come as zero surprise to me. And from the burnout perspective, I'm seeing that all the time in every workplace that I'm in. Just sort of this stress and burnout is very alive and well. And so the statistic can be startling if you haven't really been thinking about it. And it's a current number. It's from the last year or so. It's post-COVID research that is coming out that we are stressed. So it's something that it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. I've been doing a lot of work outside of mental health first aid. One thing that I kind of will throw out there is, and people are astounded by this, people don't realize that many of the signs of burnout are pretty much the exact same signs that we teach in mental health first aid around depression and anxiety. So it can look very similar. And someone in a training class asked me recently, so are you telling me this is the same thing? And I said, no, I'm not telling you that it's the same thing, but the signs, it shows up in a very, very similar way in a lot of cases, with those signs and symptoms, if you will, but that's a more medical term. Yeah. It presents itself in a very similar way. And I think a lot of employers and managers and leaders don't really realize that. When I tell that to people, I can see them sitting up in their seats like, oh, wait.
That is a pretty important statistic for all workplaces, I would say, because the impact on human harm, for one thing, the impact on humans, and then the workplace and productivity and helping people do the best work that they can and finding joy at work. We know that when stress increases, our ability to experience joy and all the positive emotions is reduced. And cognitive function. So, high stress and chronic stress over time, it's going to impact cognitive function, which is basically our decision making. Our decision making is going to be impacted. So
important for safety, right?
Yeah. So it's a circle of safety, and then also just making really good decisions in the workplace. These are all pieces of it's completely integrated. Hopefully, and as we move the needle and having more and more conversations, I think in Canada we have tons and tons of conversation about mental health. It's the next piece, which is continuing to move the needle to action, and helping workplaces understand they don't have to boil the ocean either.
I think
since we're surrounded by ocean, they don't have to boil the ocean. They can find the place that they can start, and just doing one thing in an organization can be the start of figuring out how to work with that, whether it's on the psychological health and safety side or mental health awareness or mental health first aid training, but it is moving deeper into human impact than what we have done for many, many years, which was sort of on the wellness side, which is important too, the physical wellness and all the things that we've done. But this is an extension of it. And talk a little bit about the stress sort of interest and work that you've been doing.
I've just been sitting here thinking, if anyone's listening to the podcast and they think to themselves, well, I don't know if we really have a mental health concern at our workplace. I think most people could agree that they have a stress concern at their workplace.
They do.
Yeah.
It is also a good area of conversation, because I think people, it's like physical illness. We get it. We don't have to be physicians to understand physical illness. And we don't have to be, psychologists or therapists to understand that we all have stress. We're actually built for stress.
We are, but not
we're built for stress, but not the kind of
stress. Yeah,
exactly. And all the 3 kinds of stress and all that kind of stuff within stress literacy. But it's the that we do have more tools to help manage that than maybe we think we do. But it's so damaging. I think I had read somewhere, now this statistic, I can't find the source, Alison, so don't quote me, and I'll fix it if I get it wrong, but it's something like 70 to 90% of all physical illness can be linked back or attributed to stress at some point in there. And so recognition of the harm that stress unaddressed can have in the workplace and on people.
Absolutely.
And I know it's another area that you're starting to explore, and tell me why the stress is it an outcome of all that you've been hearing in workplaces and with the people that you've been training over the last number of years that around the stress and burnout?
Yeah. I was really seeing the need. I'm in with workplaces kind of intimately for a few days, when I'm really fortunate that lots of workplaces bring me back for multiple training sessions. And so I start to get to know people, and I love that. But also I was just kind of seeing there's more layers here, right? And this emerging theme that I was seeing is people are overworked, they're overwhelmed, they're experiencing stress, they're feeling burned out and exhausted. And so that sort of took me down a road of really educating myself more on burnout and stress and so many things, just like this mental health piece, connect back there. I mean, if you want to talk about absenteeism, sick leave, reduced productivity, morale, just what we call presenteeism. And sometimes people ask me about that term. Because I come from a business background, it's a very normal term to me, but presenteeism is basically the person is there physically, but maybe not really fully present mentally. We call that presenteeism, or as I like to say, bum in chair, but not really. Right? And there's, so if we talk about all of those things, there's this huge connection, right? With stress, overwhelm, burnout, and mental health. And those are the things that employers are concerned about, right? And it's like, how do we, one of my big things that I'm exploring right now is we tend to treat burnout as an individual thing. And it is to some extent, right? Some of the things that you, Kim, may be doing in your day-to-day at work could be adding to your stress levels, right? So there is an individual responsibility there for us to learn how to reduce our stress. However, there's also a big organizational culture piece that all ties back into this whole theme of, have we set the workplace up for success? What are people's roles? What are the expectations of people within those roles? Do we have enough people to fill our roles that are needed to perform this work without expecting people to overwork, to not take breaks, to always have more on their plates than they are capable of fulfilling? And that's just like me on a really high level, touching on a few things.
You have jumped right into psychological health and safety, and those are risk factors and hazards. You've just described them beautifully, which is these are hazards and risks for organizations to start considering. And we all have responsibility for our physical health, our mental health in the workplace, and the organization has such an opportunity to take a look at some of those things. How is the work organized? What are the work conditions? What does the scheduling look like? Are they reducing uncertainty? How much uncertainty do people live with? One of the most simplest things humans and uncertainty, we do not like uncertainty. We like certainty. And so that can be a risk factor and can be a stressor, a work-related stressor. For sure. And
I think one of the things too,
go ahead.
One of the things too that maybe we're starting to see in workplaces, and, I tend to not like to talk too much about like generational differences. I actually worked on that in my master's thesis about like generational differences at work. And I tend to I don't like to lump everybody under the same umbrella, but I do think we're seeing some changes in the workplace where some people are taking their mental and physical wellness much more seriously. And so if they find themselves in a work environment that does not support their well-being, their psychological safety, their mental health, they're going to go somewhere else and find something else. And so I think in the coming years, we will see more importance being placed on this in workplaces from a recruitment and a retention piece of, okay, we need to be paying attention to this because otherwise we're not going to be able to keep good people or like the people that we need in our workplaces. And that's just a thought. I'm not backing that up with anything right now, but I definitely
am absolutely with you.
Yeah.
I am going down that path with you. In fact, I'm going to even go a little further as we wrap up our conversation, because we could have another great conversation about the stress and burnout as well, because I think that is worth deeper conversation for sure. But I was in a session and one of the participants had raised this question, and she said that and I'm now putting it out to all of our listeners. So this is the question that I think is the question of the day for a person that's in an interview in a job right now and going forward, which is to ask the question, to add to those questions. You know, in every job interview, there's all the questions that they ask of you. And this is the question, and I think it aligns exactly with what you were saying about some of different people having different interests and discerning, is this organization going to support me in different ways than perhaps in the past? And the question is, how is this organization going to take care of my psychological health and safety and mental health at work? And that's my question in the interview process. And if that question starts getting asked because of the shift and the change, as you had described, that will help the workplace really clearly see, you know, what is already happening, which is making some of those decisions based on the workplace culture and whether the organization is taking mental health and psychological health and safety seriously. So I thought that was the most beautiful question that could be asked. So now I'm sharing it with everyone and letting people know that this is a question for you to ask. And it's a very clear, it's the clearest question you can ask. And it's not that I don't think the organization has to say, well, we have this, this, and this in place. My thought is the way in which they ponder the question is a really wonderful indicator of whether this is a good organization. Because we know these are, in many organizations, as you described early, sort of they're doing certain things, but perhaps they're not as far advanced on certain other things in occupational health and safety, for psychological health and safety. So the answer is not that, yes, I have these 5 things. Here's how we do it. We have a management system in place. We do mental health first aid. We also do stress literacy. We do emotional literacy. We work together to look at work design. That's not necessarily the answer. Would that be ideal in an organization? Yes. As we go through and evolve some of those workplace culture priorities. However, I think it's the way in which they consider that kind of question, which would be kind of an amazing indicator of the flexibility and openness of the organization and recognition of how important the whole human is. And we all bring our whole selves to work.
Yeah.
And what are you thinking about taking care of that?
Yeah. We all have a brain.
Yes. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm going to ask you one thing before you go, which is if you could give advice to workplaces on what they can do and to really focus on the people inside the organization and take care of them based on some of the context that you've been seeing over the last couple of years. What would you suggest that they do?
Ooh. Well, I'm obviously a big fan of mental health first aid. I think it's also really important to do comprehensive surveys or focus groups with your full workforce to get feedback on wellness, mental health, psychological safety concerns, because it's so important to actually hear from people and not just assume you know what the needs are. I mean, there's a bit of that can come from like sick leave reports and things like that, but you want to be hearing from your people in a non-biased way what they feel is needed. So I think that can be really important. And working on creating a culture of care. Like we actually care about you as a person. And that kind of will come from the top, I think, and into leaders and managers, how they communicate with their teams, how they listen. Just the genuineness has to be there. And I think that's how we start, right? We start by actually caring and then figuring out how do we implement some changes in our organization.
That is great advice. That is excellent advice, Alison. Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for listening. And again, and joining us here today and joining me with my guest, Alison Butler. Alison, how can people reach you if they wanted to reach out to you?
Well, the best place is my website, and I'm sure you'll have it in the show notes or somewhere for people to find. But my name is Alison, spelled with one L, Butler. And so my website is alisonbutler.ca. I have all of the information there on mental health first aid, how to get in touch with me. I'm also very, very active on LinkedIn. So if anyone wants to search me up and connect with me there, I post regularly about mental health, burnout, my own journey. So I would love to connect there. Just let me know in the comments that you heard me on the podcast, and I'll be happy to connect. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for being here. Until next time. And you can reach out to me on LinkedIn too. I'm generally there every day. It's like a room. It's just a separate room in my office. So you can reach out to me there or at 13factors.ca. And thanks for joining us for Flourish DX Psych Health and Safety Canada. And have a great day. And hopefully you'll check out some of the other episodes on the podcast as well.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.